So I'm not saying, guys, that Antonio Brown won't be a great receiver for several more years. But just as I was talking about Dwayne Wade earlier, or you could think of Kobe toward the end of his career, just because they're still great, you forget why you wanted to pay the premium for them in the first place. They're not great like everyone else. They're different great. And what I'm saying is, it is unlikely that Antonio Brown will be different great for more than another year or two. For that reason, guys, given what he's paid and the locker room issues, I ain't giving you more than a second-round pick. I'm sorry. Like, I'm not even putting a fifth behind it. I'm giving you a second-round pick for Antonio Brown. Take it or leave it.
Well, Max, I can get where you're coming from, but I'm going to go a first-round pick. And the reason why I'm going to go a first-round pick is that even though he's younger and presumably with a bigger upside, the fact of the matter is Amari Cooper had 2 down years in Oakland when the Raiders traded him for a first-round pick. And so often, Lewis, you can speak to this, a lot of times we look at precedent. And we see what precedent has been set to justify the market value of somebody to follow. And if you are Antonio Brown, that's exactly what you're in a position to do. 6 consecutive years with at least 101 receptions and 1,287 yards. Period. When you have that level of production coming your way, even in a down year where you missed the playoffs and you were ruffling feathers and there was clear friction between you and your quarterback with another number 1 receiver on the roster. Now, if I'm another team, I have to imagine, first of all, do I even have one number 1? If the answer is no, that's a plus for Antonio Brown. Number 2, if I can pair him with a quarterback, dare I say that's better than Big Ben Roethlisberger, that would be plus number 2. And obviously, if I've got those 2 things working in my favor, a quarterback that is better than Big Ben Roethlisberger, this guy would clearly be the number 1 receiver on this squad, then excuse me, that's something that I have to take into consideration. And to attack Max's point, when you talk about take it or leave it, well, here's the problem. There's 32 teams in the NFL. All you got to find is one sucker now. That's all you got to find. And if you find somebody that's worried about Antonio Brown being somewhere else because you wanted to hold out on forfeiting the number 1 pick and somebody else comes and they take him from you, particularly if there's somebody in your division or what have you, that might be something that's worth consideration as well. So, again, I understand the distraction that he has been. I understand what a headache it is. I understand that the way he has conducted himself recently, it must have been tough for Rooney to stomach that meeting, to have to sit up there with a guy that basically did everything he could to cause the friction with the Steelers. I'm not talking about during the season, but in the last few weeks, because it certainly doesn't speak to team. It's definitely all about and that's how it has looked. But in the end, I got to look at this surreal talent who is clearly big time and think about how people have given up more for less. And I got to say, I'm going to give up a number 1 pick for Antonio Brown if I have the quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, Andrew Luck, somebody like that.
Hey, Lewis.
If I got that, I got to give up the number 1
That's
pick.
what I'm talking about. Look, I'm talking about you have to look at context is important here when you're talking about trying to project what a team is going to give up for a guy like this, or what would you give up for a guy like this. If you have any of the things in place, both on the football field and organizationally, that could help to keep a player like Antonio Brown on the straight and narrow and doing the things that he needs to do in a positive way to help put you over the top. And by over the top, I mean this. I'm talking about conference championships / Super Bowls. That's where you then start talking about, is he worth a number 1 pick? Is he worth doing that? Because, again, you're talking about a guy who's on the backside of his career, who, when you're projecting future performance, I know Antonio has tremendous stats in the past. I know he's been tearing it up for the better part of 5 years. But that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what he's going to do in the future, especially when you're on the plus side of 30. That isn't just the NFL. That's life. It's about projecting. You get paid contracts based on what you're potentially going to give someone. Let me ask you this. There are no contracts that are given for – you don't get contracts for what you've done in the past.
This isn't like a reward. I want to ask you this as an executive. When you have a guy like Antonio Brown and the problems he just had in Pittsburgh, again, according to Warren Sharp Analytics, which I highly recommend, you can follow him on Twitter, guys, like I do. But according to him, the Steelers were the second most, over the last 3 years, the second most pass-heavy offense in neutral situations. So even though you got Juju Smith-Schuster and you had other targets, Antonio Brown is in an offense where he's getting the ball all the time. It is unlikely he winds up in another situation, even as the primary target, which of course he would be, where he's going to be happy about the number of catches, targets he's going to get. And think of what he just did in Pittsburgh when he was unhappy.
But, Max, that's not his issue. That's not his issue. I spoke to Antonio Brown. That's not his issue. I think what it comes down to, everybody thinking about the number of touches, et cetera, et cetera. There's friction with him and Ben. He does not like this man right now. He does not like the way that he's been talked about. He does not like the way he's been treated. And I'm not saying that Big Ben Roethlisberger is totally wrong. Clearly, Antonio Brown is wrong in all of this when you consider how he has conducted himself. But I think it's false to assume that it's about touches. It's about how you talk to somebody, how you talk about somebody, the kind of rhetoric that you're spewing, whether it's behind their back or in their face, in a huddle, on the sidelines, etc. Ben Roethlisberger does have some questions to answer because Antonio Brown is not the only one he has had a problem with.
But
He's also had a problem with offensive coordinators.
Lewis, so hearing what Stephen A. just said, you're an executive, but given what I just said, as an executive of another team, what are you thinking about Antonio Brown, bringing him to the locker room, keeping him happy and all that?
Well, again, I mean, my point continues to be just that. It continues to really reference just that. Number one, what I'm going to want to do is this. I'm going to want to look internally and say, look, okay, what is my situation at quarterback? What is my situation at the leadership in my locker room? What is my situation as far as where I think we are at in terms of challenging for a Super Bowl title? And if we bring a guy in here like this, I'm going to want to know from him, look, what exactly is it that you're after? Are you after personal glory or are you after team glory?